Colosseums, and they would have these Greek fights in these Colosseums, in these theaters. It wasn't Colosseums yet, but it was in these theaters. And this was impacting Israel, and it started impacting the Jews in Jerusalem, especially the youth. It really reached out to the youth. The youth really loved these games. They were excited about these games. And what began to happen, according to history, was that these young priests started changing their dress. They started changing how they dressed. They wanted to fit in to this new Greek culture. It was appealing to them. It was something that it didn't seem like much harm. And so what they started to do, these young priests started wearing hats, Greek hats. Literally, it was Greek hats that they started wearing. And some say, well, what's wrong with that? There's nothing. We all have different clothes today that comes from someplace around the world. But these youth priests were becoming so influenced by it that they don't stop with that. They go a little further, and it becomes what's known as Antioch in Jerusalem. And Antioch in Jerusalem was developed by Antiochus IV. He was also known as Epiphanes, which just means that he's the master god, literally, that he was master god. And he begins to really push this Greek culture into Jerusalem. And so much so that they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem just outside of the temple, that these young priests could start practicing, and they could start becoming more involved in the Greek games. They wanted to be able to go to Dor on the shores of the Mediterranean in northern Israel and compete in these Greek games. This is what they're hoping to do, is to compete in these Greek games. And so now they're trying to fit in so they can get there. And Antiochus is okay with it. And especially those that are in leadership, because this is their target. As long as Jerusalem stood and held the customs, the Jewish customs and the Jewish law, and held to the Bible, to the Scripture, and held to the law of God, and performed all the sacrifices and did everything that they were supposed to do, as long as they kept doing that, they were an obstacle to their political agenda. They were an obstacle to what they wanted to do. They needed these people on their side. As long as the Jews kept teaching the Word of God and abstaining from the appearances of evil and to hold true to God and to be true to God, they were an obstacle. And so Antiochus tries to influence them. They try to allure them. They try to get them on board. And they make it literally Antioch of Jerusalem. And not only that, but they are now preparing. And I want you to hear this. They're now preparing to go. This is in Israel now. They're trying to prepare to go and compete in these Olympia Games. And it's where we get the same Olympic Games today. And but the problem with it was that if they go and they compete in these games, they had to partake. If you were an Olympian, you had to sacrifice and you had to pledge to the Greek gods there. You had to go through the same rituals of the Greek gods. And these young priests did it. They first started off just dressing like them. Then they set up a gymnasium next to their temple. Then now they're getting ready to compete, and they're willing to go and do exactly different and opposite what God commanded them to do. But it all started mildly and slowly. Just like Rome over in Italy is now beginning to develop and getting the Etruscans and other Latins with them and these other villages. They're including all of these gods and all of these beliefs. And as long as they do that, it's okay. You can do whatever you want to. There's no really set limit here. You can worship whatever God you want. It'll be better with our rule. And people were coming into it. And it was happening in Israel simultaneously. Now here is where it really floored me. When I started studying this, and I thought, I was looking, and there's a bunch of details. I don't have all of them with me, and I'm hoping to, in my efforts and the work that I'm doing on this, I'm hoping to put this to writing because I believe it's necessary. But what they started doing, these young priests, these young Jews, they were given a name. And they even though that they wore the Greek hats, and they begin to wear the Greek outfits, and they get the gymnasium, and they want to go and they want to partake in these Olympian Games. They have to get involved with these pagan worships, and they're okay with that. It's all right for me to get involved with that. They had already justified it. But the problem was this, was that Greek culture was all about really exposing the entire body. Anywhere you look in Rome and Greek culture and the sculptures, you can't see one of these sculptures without the body doesn't have no clothes on. The only clothes you usually see is on the shoulder. And I always wondered why that. Well, that's mighty cold, wouldn't you think? If all you got's the shoulder don't need the covering. But they were fascinated with this because it was an emblem of strength and power and might. They sculpted everything this way. They developed everything this way. Well, there's a problem with the Jews with this, because the Jews were circumcised, and it identified them differently. They could hide that under the Greek garments and clothes. But if they go and they partake in these Greek games, they're circumcised, and they would not be allowed to do it, and they would be poked fun at, and they would be identified as Jews. And what they're trying to do is to fit in. They don't want to be identified as Jews anymore. They don't want to stand out in the crowd anymore. And this is what really, it blew my mind. But they literally reversed their circumcision. And they were called stretchers. And you can think about that however you want to. But what they did, they reversed their circumcision. And that was a painful thing for a grown person or a grown man. And they went to that extent. And the reason I mention it is because they went to that great length. And they went that far just so they could fit in with this new Hellenized, Greek, prosperous, alluring, something that seemed like it would elevate them culture. The young priest did this. Are you hearing me? The young priest went to that extent. And even in Jewish law, you'll find it also in Jewish law. The Jewish law said they were trying to find an answer for this. In the Jewish law, they asked the rabbis and the sages, because this had became, if it was one or two instances, it would have never made it to writing. But this must have been a huge thing that was going on. And it was so huge that the sages must have been asked, the Jewish rabbis, and they write it in their law, and they write about these stretchers, and they said, well, it's permissible that they can be recircumcised the second time, and God will still accept it. So they even had made an exception to the rule. But the reason I'm sharing this is because at what great length you have the influence, you have the element of prosperity, you have the element of fitting in, you have the element of people getting along, you have the element of something that is alluring. But in order to do it, they had to give up what they believed. And they had to give up who they believed in. They could no longer believe in a monotheistic God. They could no longer believe that there was just one supreme God. They had to believe in all the gods. And they did it. And that blew my mind. This was going on in the silent years of these 400 years of silence between Malachi and Matthew. This was what was happening during this season. And this is why it was so important for Jesus to come on the scene. This was the scene Jesus came to, by the way, but it changes a little over time when Pompey comes in 64, 63 BC, and he conquers Israel, and he takes over and knocks out the Greeks and the Hasmoneans, and he takes over Israel and now begins to push Rome influence into it. This is what happened. This is how far Hellenization went. It influenced the Romans. It influenced what they were doing. They were putting it into the culture. Now this is where I want to go with it. And this is important. And I know it's just teaching, but this is very important. I hope that it's beneficial tonight. I believe it is. But Rome had a problem with theaters. Greeks were big on theaters. They were the first ones to build theaters around about 6-5 BC. This is 500, 600 BC. They were building theaters in Greece. Among the Greeks, they're building theaters. But the Romans hadn't caught on to it yet. And matter of fact, many of the Romans believed, even though they served pagan gods and they had all of these ancestral gods, the Romans said that these theaters were a source of immorality. The Romans said that. These were the early Romans, of course. They said it was a source of immorality. Well, it proved out to be right. But they initially would not accept and would not build theaters. The first theater we find built in Italy among the Roman Empire was in Pompeii. Pompeii was the one destroyed by Vesuvius, if you remember, and those ashes that conquered Pompeii. But the first one we find theater built was there, and that was largely because it's toward the southern end of Italy, and that's where the Greeks were. That's where the Greeks were. But the idea was why they couldn't really believe in doing these theaters. But as people started becoming more influenced with the Greeks, the Romans have a problem because most of the people don't believe in it because they believe it's a sense of immorality, but the politicians are trying to find a way to slip it in because they need to keep their people. Because if they don't, they're going to lose them down to these Greek cities. Greeks may take over. They'll lose their power. Rome now is beginning to expand. It's expanding throughout Italy. The empire's starting to take off. And in the first century BC, we start seeing Rome really spread. That's when it begins to become one of the largest empires until the Greeks. But if you look, here's what the politicians had to do. They had to come up with a solution. And this is what I studied in history, and this really blew my mind. But they had to come up with a solution on what to do with how can we get theaters and people to accept theaters. And this was the solution. This emblem was the solution for their problem. What you're looking at is a diagram in the 2nd century of Gabi. It's a site in Gabi, and this was the Temple of Juno. This area was the Temple of Juno. All of this was just a platform because more people are starting to get involved. This was just porticos and all the different rooms, and this was their temple, and this was all the different area. But now something happens. If you would look out front of the temple, they've now started setting up, and technically they wouldn't call it a theater. Some historians call this a theater, but it wasn't a theater. They called it bleachers. And here out right in the same entire temple complex of these Romans, in order to get people to accept the ideal of the theater, they began to build it into the same complex as the temple. And here they began by just using it as a setting for people to watch temple rituals. But then it changed. And they started introducing other things with it. And they started introducing more things other than just temple things that were being practiced. They started practicing many different things. Not only that one, but also this one. This is around, I think, the first century. This is one of the temples that is built. And again, they build this like theater, but it's just, they call it bleachers, but other historians literally call it a theater. And they start building it right into the temple, and people are beginning to accept it. And as they begin to accept, this is another shot of that same complex. Matter of fact, this is how massive this place is. If you would look at this retaining wall, and all this was a platform, and here is the bleachers, you can see it's a theater. And they began to build this into their religious system. Are you following me? And they're beginning to highlight this right into their religious complex. And people began to accept it. It was the one way that they were able to get people to accept this new culture and this new ideal and this new style, was if they put it into their place of worship. Think about it. Think about it. This is another